Subtitling by ZDF 2020. Satellites allow us to view the Earth in ways that are hidden from the naked eye. With increasingly high-resolution images, it is possible to observe changes on the Earth's surface over the long term. This way, we can measure how bodies of water change over time, how cities grow, and how forests are deforested. But can we also recognize very small objects on the surface, like a beetle, for example? More on that later. Since the beginning of industrialization, humans have had a significant impact on the natural processes of our planet by emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The consequences are rising global temperatures, increased intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, and a multitude of chain reactions triggered as a result. The decline of polar sea ice, the thawing of permafrost, or an increased vulnerability of forests due to more frequent droughts are just a few examples. Intense heat and dry periods, coupled with sometimes unnatural forestry practices, increasingly lead to significant damage to tree populations, and in some cases even to die off entire forests. Between the years 2018 and 2021 alone, approximately 500,000 hectares of tree loss were recorded in Germany, according to data from the German Aerospace Center. Drought periods also increase the risk of forest fires and the vulnerability to invasive species. And so we return to our beetle. You may have heard of this specimen before. The bark beetle has increasingly made headlines in recent years, and is considered one of the most dangerous pests for forestry. Normally the bark beetle, or more specifically the two subspecies, the European spruce bark beetle and the six-toothed bark beetle, acts as a secondary pest. These only infest sick or dying trees. A healthy tree produces more resin as a defense mechanism to prevent the beetle from penetrating the bark. However, if the tree is stressed, for example, by an extended dry period, it cannot employ these defense mechanisms as usual. Global climate change thus plays a significant role in the threat to forest posed by the bark beetle. But back to the original question, Can a beetle really be observed from space? The answer is both yes and no. Standard satellites with a spatial resolution of about 10 meters cannot, of course, capture an individual beetle. However, what is clearly visible are the damages that bark beetles leave in our forests. Thank you very much. The head of the Earth Observation Center at the German Aerospace Center has made it her mission to quantify the exact extent of forest damage in Germany using satellite data. For this purpose, they analyzed over 20,000 datasets of high-resolution images from the Sentinel-2 and Landsat-8 missions.
So, what motivated us for this study were actually two factors. One was that through the Copernicus program, one could suddenly say, hey, data availability that we didn't have before. There are various radar satellites and optical satellites that make data available with a very high temporal resolution. And in addition, there is a peculiarity in the German forest system, if you will, that actually does not foresee clear cutting, but as a result of these drought periods, there were simply vast areas that were affected, and the forestry industry felt compelled to react quickly. Reacting quickly means clearing large areas, and clearing means creating clear-cut areas. This combination of being able to recognize large-scale patterns and having the data available was simply a very important prerequisite for being able to conduct such a study.
The results of the study make it possible to capture spatial and temporal changes in forest areas across Germany.
This map shows the forest losses per Bau district in Germany for the period from early 2018 to early 2021. And in the red colors, you can identify the districts. The damages are the greatest. And when you look at the numbers, up to a third of the forest area has disappeared in some districts. You can clearly see that the damages are primarily concentrated in the middle of Germany. This extends from the east, from the Saxon Switzerland, over to the Eifel. This is an area where we predominantly find coniferous forests, and the damages we have recorded here are also primarily in coniferous forests.
The classification of such areas is done through a spectral analysis of the satellite images. This false color image of Arnsberg in the Hochsauerland district shows a change in a forest area between 2017 and 2021. A forest road representation not only uses the channels of visible light, which are also perceivable by humans, but in this example, it also utilizes an infrared channel. Vegetation reflects light particularly strongly in the near-infrared wavelength range and is therefore well suited to visualize changes in the condition of a forest.
We are talking about data, as we can see here, examples from Sentinel-2. Once, from the time before the damage began from the year 2017. And opposite that, a composite in Mort at a later time, and you can clearly see, based on the greenish or dark green areas, that a large part of the areas is damaged at a later time. When you conduct this comparison in detail, you can see that the areas that are only damaged in the right image appear in the green color cells, that in the left image are primarily marked in dark red tones. In the false color composites, we see vital vegetation in the different shades of red. Here, the light red is essentially deciduous forest, while the dark red areas, which we can mainly see in the center, are predominantly dominated by coniferous forest. By comparing, it quickly becomes clear that the damages are primarily found in the northern forest regions.
The causes of these forest damages can be attributed to various factors. Climatic events such as droughts, storms, or fires can lead to tree damage, and invasive species like the bark beetle are also among the causes of damage. However, differentiating these damaging events is not so simple.
The difficulty with the bark beetle is that it is usually not a single damaging event, or not a single cause, but rather a complex of various causes. So long dry periods favor bark beetle infestations just as long heat periods. And starting from 2018, we had several of these drought and heat periods, which varied greatly in intensity across different regions and times within Germany. But a single rainfall event cannot compensate for a prolonged drought, so we could indeed observe effects throughout Germany. Over time, you can also get a pretty good idea of how such damages occur. Nevertheless, we are, of course, not able to identify a single bark beetle. That means we actually only see the result in the end. This is perhaps one of the main difficulties. In this map, as I briefly mentioned earlier, we have very different causes of damage, and sometimes they overlap as well. So a drought situation, a bark beetle situation, they often have to do with each other. And then to differentiate, is this now bark beetle damage or is it drought damage? That is sometimes difficult to impossible. Ultimately, it's a major challenge, even just to differentiate the causes of damage. This can be relatively successful if you have additional information, especially since weather data plays a significant role. Then you can, for example, identify storm damage or other damages regionally. You can narrow it down well, both regionally and temporally. And other damages like fire can be detected very well, even spectrally. But precisely these questions, which are relevant for the future of forests, such as bark beetle infestations, and of course there are many other harmful insects in other forests, drought stress, temperature stress, heat waves, and so on, are very interesting. They cannot be easily managed or eradicated.
Satellite data do not allow us to recognize a single beetle from space, and distinguishing between the different causes is often quite challenging. However, the various causes are often closely linked or even mutually reinforcing. Therefore, long-term and large-scale observation of endangered regions still helps us to take appropriate measures to protect the forests.
Driven by the drought damage of recent years or forest damage in general in the context of dryness, various initiatives have sprung up to generate remote sensing-based products. These products describe the condition of the forest, are interested in forest damage, and characterize forest damage. These are perhaps a number of products that sometimes do similar things, but also differ significantly in some cases. And a few years ago, such things did not exist because the need was simply not yet recognized. Forest management, forestry in general, is something that is planned for the long term. This means that planning for the coming years should have been done in the past. This was indeed done, but adapting the forest simply takes time. And we, as burner customers, rely on the fact that further new values will emerge, with which things that seem unthinkable today might become possible. And especially at the time when he was talking about Pünzler, artificial intelligence and also the efforts of the ESA to bring new sensors into space, keyword hyperspectral for exploration. That's why I am quite optimistic that there will be new products in the future as well.
Future planned missions, such as CHIME, the hyperspectral mission of the ESA, will provide new high-resolution data that will likely enable spectral differentiation of the causes. What the current data already clearly tells us today is that our forests are changing. Increasingly frequent extreme weather events, altered precipitation patterns, and unnatural forestry practices weaken the trees' natural defense mechanisms, making them more susceptible to the bark beetle.